Howdy folks, and welcome back to Armoured Warfare with the mighty Jingles, and we've got a bit of a special one for you today. Today's video is all about the Tier 5 main battle tank, the Chieftain Mark V, and the new premium version of the Chieftain, the Mark 6 Leader, and you can see it right there, and holy cow, isn't it beautiful. And to celebrate, I've got 50 of them to give away. Jingles, you magnificent bastard, you had me at howdy folks. How do I get my hands on one of these Mark 6 Chieftains? Well, just check the link in the video description and enter the giveaway for a chance to win one of the 50 tanks. Go on, pause the video, I'll wait for you to get back. Okay, done? Right. So, the Chieftain Main Battle Tank. Despite the fact that the British invented the tank and used it to great effect in the final years of the First World War, further tank development in Britain got kind of lost after the First World War, thanks to a lack of money, resources, and the conflicting demands of policing a worldwide empire. Ironically, it was the defeated Germans who saw the full potential of the tank, and with the rise to power of Adolf Hitler, the concept of the Blitzkrieg was nurtured with devastating consequences. British tank designs lagged behind their German counterparts throughout World War II in terms of firepower and armour protection, and most of them suffered from terrible mechanical unreliability. The situation was made worse by having different classes of tanks for both infantry support and offensive operations. By 1944, Field Marshal Montgomery and others were advocating the concept of a universal tank to replace the discredited infantry and cruiser classes, but the idea wasn't pursued until after the Second World War had ended. The design of the so-called universal tank began in 1946 under the designation A45, just as the final example of the cruiser class of tanks, the Centurion, was entering service with the British Army. But development of the A45 was slow and troublesome, and the whole universal tank concept was compromised when it was too difficult to modify the design of the A45 for special purpose tasks such as amphibious assault or minesweeping. The A45 project was abandoned in 1948 in favour of further development of the Centurion. Ironically, the Centurion was able to be adapted to most of the roles envisaged for the universal concept, and it did prove to be the outstanding tank of its generation. The development of a successor to the Centurion began in 1951 under the designation Medium Gun Tank No. 2. The threat was now posed by the massed armoured forces of the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact client states. The Soviet bloc was equipped with thousands of effective medium tanks such as the T-34-85, supported by hundreds of heavy tanks including the IS-3 with its very powerful 122mm gun. To counter these massed numbers, the Western Allies pursued a strategy of quality over quantity, but in the early 1950s the only NATO countries manufacturing tanks in any kind of numbers were Britain and the USA. Therefore, the two countries cooperated in many aspects of tank design, including a desire for a standard main armament. Initially, the plan was to use the American T-104 105mm gun firing high-velocity armour-piercing, and high-explosive anti-tank rounds. The only problem was that the T-104 was a massive weapon, and the handling and stowage of its ammunition inside the fighting compartment was going to prove problematic when using normal one-piece rounds with brass shell casings. One solution was to provide an auto-loading mechanism, but this was going to be overly complex and unreliable, and would only allow space for 40 rounds of ammunition to be stowed under the armour. In 1953, it was decided to investigate the feasibility of liquid propellant guns. Now, this technology did offer several significant advantages, including simpler ammunition handling, as the loader only had to manhandle the projectile and not the shell casing. It would also give an increase in muzzle velocity. The most significant problem with the liquid propellant gun was that in order to be able to withstand the necessary pressures, the liquid fuel reservoir would have been so big it would have been completely impractical to include it inside a tank. Another idea was the whole bagged charge or two-piece ammunition concept, which had been successfully used by the world's navies. Its application in a tank was novel, and it did present several advantages over fixed one-piece ammunition. The main benefits were easier handling within the fighting compartment for the loader, and increased stowage space to allow more ammunition to be carried. The weight of the metal cases was saved, and you didn't have to worry about collecting the spent cases inside the turret after firing the gun. In essence, the loader rams a projectile, whether it's armour-piercing or high-explosive, into the breech, followed by the bagged propellant charge. A vent tube primer then ignites the charge, which is completely consumed in the breech in the subsequent explosion. Trials demonstrated that the use of two-piece ammunition didn't reduce the rate of fire from the desired 6 rounds a minute. There were reservations concerning the risk of catastrophic ammunition fires if the bagged charges in their stowage bins were penetrated by red-hot fragments. The design of the Centurion, for example, ensured that all main armament ammunition was stowed below the level of the turret ring, where they were far less likely to be ignited if the turret was penetrated. The bag-charged propellant in the medium gun tank No. 2 prototype was therefore also stowed below the level of the turret ring. Not only this, they were stowed in water jackets, which if penetrated by red-hot fragments, doused the bag charge in a water glycol mixture that either completely prevented or delayed the ignition of the cordite charge. Thanks to the nature of two-piece ammunition, this allowed armour-piercing ammunition, which had no explosive content, to be stowed around the walls of the turret and in outside stowage bins for rapid replenishment on the battlefield. All of the propellant charges and high explosive projectiles were stowed in the hull. The next thing to do was to identify the calibre of weapon that was going to be needed on the tank. The British and Americans identified the requirement for a tank gun capable of defeating 120mm of rolled homogeneous steel armour inclined at 60 degrees at a range of 2,000 yards. The joint assessment was completed by April 1956 and recommended a 120mm main gun with bagged charge ammunition. It's more or less at this point where the British and the Americans went their separate ways. Despite the recommendations, the US Army weren't convinced with the whole concept of 120mm gun with bag charge ammunition and preferred a smoothbore gun of 90mm calibre. And so the British went their own way, with Leyland Motors being appointed as the main design contractor for the new tank that was now designated the FV4201 instead of medium gun tank No. 2. By now the whole design of the FV4201 was well advanced and married to new suspension units. Various configurations for the frontal area of the hull were considered, mainly based on Soviet designs. At first, a complex sloping of welded plates similar to the IS-3 was tried, but then it was decided to take a step backwards. When the British took over their sector of Berlin, after the Soviet occupation in 1945, a collapsed apartment block was cleared to reveal an IS-2 heavy tank. Instead of welded plates, it featured a cast hull front with well-sloped armour, and this was copied for FV4201. Similarly, the turret front of FV4201 was a massive casting, which after a cooling period of at least 12 months, was welded together with the roof and the rear turret section of rolled plate armour. Unfortunately for Leyland Motors, this is where things started to get complicated. The design of the turret had undergone alteration following a revised user requirement in November 1957 for an increase in gun elevation and depression from plus 15 and minus 7.5 degrees to plus 20 and minus 10 degrees. This meant a larger turret, which meant an increase in weight, which was compounded by yet another new user requirement for infrared night fighting and vision equipment, with a 22-inch searchlight projector in an armoured housing on the side of the turret. Furthermore, the Army now demanded an increase in armour thickness on both the turret frontal aspect and the glacis plate. Experience in Korea had shown that tanks needed greater protection against strikes from medium artillery shells. Although these didn't necessarily penetrate the tank's armour, they could cause welding seams to fail, with consequent damage to the interior. So huge single-pieced cast sections for the hull and turret were preferred. By now the weight of FV4201 was rising, but worse was to come. In late 1957, the Standardization Committee in NATO determined that all NATO fighting vehicles should be powered by engines capable of running on a wide variety of fuels, from standard diesel or kerosene to petrol or even domestic heating oil. This decision was to have far-reaching consequences for FV4201. The multi-fuel policy had obvious attractions. At the flick of the switch in the driving compartment, military vehicles could refuel from various facilities across Europe, whether it's a commercial petrol station or an apartment block oil storage tank. In January 1958, to conform with this policy, it was decided to install a new engine for FV4201, and a German compression ignition opposed piston design, derived from a Junkers Jumo aviation engine of World War II vintage, was chosen for further development as a multi-fuel tank power plant. Not only did this cause a further delay in the FV4201 development cycle because the engine compartment had to be completely redesigned, it also added an extra ton to the weight, which was now estimated to be nearing 50 tons. This new engine was designated the L60. From the very beginning, the Royal Armoured Corps held severe reservations about the L60 engine, but the politicians brushed these reservations aside. It proved to be a disastrous decision for the Chieftain tank. Britain's NATO partners very quickly realised that the multi-fuel concept was completely impractical and abandoned the idea. Each of the tank-producing countries adopted standard diesel engines that proved reliable and effective. Only the British continued to pursue the multi-fuel concept with a completely unsuitable engine until it was far too late. Running trials of the new tank began during the early part of 1960, but only on roads and with the engine speed governed to 1800 RPM. Attempts to run the engine on a variety of fuels proved extremely problematic, and Royal Electrical and Mechanical engineers discovered that it would take at least 8 hours to modify the feed system of the engine for different fuels, which was an obvious impossibility in the field under combat conditions. The whole multi-fuel concept was a disaster from the start, but unfortunately the FV4201 was now lumbered with an engine whose performance was woefully inadequate and beginning to give cause for grave concern. Failures occurred due to excessive engine vibration and in the gear train between the top and bottom crankshafts. Problems were encountered with overheating of the gearbox and the hydraulic fan drives. In time, these problems, while not fixed, were lessened by various measures such as reducing the crankshaft speed to 2100 RPM from the intended 2400 and moving the exhaust silencers into an armoured box attached to the rear of the hull. All of these modifications added to the overall weight of the vehicle, which had now risen to nearly 50 tons. This meant that the suspension units, which had originally been designed for a vehicle weighing 45 tons, had to be strengthened, causing yet a further increase in weight, as did the decision to fit rubber pads to the tracks, to conform with German requirements to limit the damage to roads during exercises by the British Army of the Rhine. With an engine output of just 500 brake horsepower, this gave a power-to-weight ratio of only 10 brake horsepower per tonne, or less than 2/3 of the general staff requirement. Thankfully, gunnery trials proved that the performance of the 120mm L11 main gun was very, very good. However, some deficiencies were noted. The original M85 coaxial ranging gun had to be replaced with the M2 Browning. The whole ranging gun system was always seen as an interim measure, pending the introduction of a fully integrated laser rangefinder which was still under development. Firing 3-round bursts of tracer ammunition that would ignite on striking a hard target, the ranging gun had to be precisely aligned with the main armament to be of any use, but once it was correctly aligned, it was a very simple, cost-efficient and tough system that had the advantage of automatically factoring in various different variables necessary for accurate firing. However, the problem was that in the early days it was only effective out to a range of 1500 yards, which kind of negated the whole long-range capability of the 120mm main gun in the first place. The workload for the loader and radio operator was also excessive. He had to maintain and serve 3 weapons and the radios, as well as providing the crew with hot drinks and meals from the boiling vessel mounted behind the main gun. But worst of all was an electromechanical device for ramming the projectile into the breech that was completely unreliable and an actual hazard to the loader himself. Royal Tank Regiment tankies quickly devised an alternative means to seat the projectile by actually using the combustible cartridge case itself as a rammer. Despite official disapproval, this eventually became the standard method of loading the gun. However, the worst aspect of the Chieftain, certainly as far as its crews were concerned, which was going to be an issue with the tank throughout its entire career, was the lack of an internal heater. It had gone as a victim of one of the weight-saving measures. The culmination of the Chieftain's trials was a 72-hour closed-down exercise whereby a 5 RTR crew manned a Chieftain for a 3-day period without opening any hatches at all, while a reserve crew refueled and serviced the vehicle from the outside. Each day the tank had to undertake at least 10 hours of motoring over all manner of terrain, while all equipment such as radios and gun stabilizer were operating in order to test everything fully. The exercises ended with a comprehensive shoot on Honer Range 7A, with all ammunition being expended. Although generally successful, the trials demonstrated that there were still many faults to be fixed before series production could begin, particularly with the engine and the transmission. Nevertheless, the Chieftain was accepted for service on the 1st of May 1963 in order to allow production to start, but over the next 2 years only an extra 35 brake horsepower could be squeezed out of the L60 engine before it equipped the Chieftain Mark I, of which 40 were built. The Mark I, however, was only used for troop trials and training. One of the first Chieftain Mark Is to arrive at the School of Mechanical and Electrical Engineers Bolton was so underpowered that it was incapable of climbing onto a tank transporter. The first proper Chieftain model, the Mark II, was delivered to the British Army from Royal Ordnance Factory at Leeds on the 18th of April 1966, and the first armoured regiment to be equipped with the new main battle tank was the 11th Hussars, known as the Cherry Pickers, which received its first 6 Chieftains in November 1966. Being very happy with the performance of their Centurion tanks, Israel expressed a lot of interest in the new Chieftain tank. After protracted discussions while the Foreign and Commonwealth Office dithered around for fear of offending Arab opinion, the British eventually agreed to sell Chieftain to the Israeli Defence Force, including setting up a production line in Israel. The Israelis agreed to share development costs and provided their own particular expertise in operating tanks in desert conditions. Two Chieftains Mark II arrived in Israel for trials with the Israeli Defense Force in early 1967, but within months, the whole region was plunged into conflict with the outbreak of the Six-Day War in June. Very nervous Foreign Office officials cabled Tel Aviv and demanded that the chieftains be moved from the border regions of the Negev desert with Egypt for fear of Arab accusations of collusion with the Israelis. The Israelis sent a reply, "Have no fears, we have moved the borders." On the 17th of October 1968, the Israeli government made an official request to Britain to purchase the Chieftain. In April 1969, another Israeli delegation arrived in Britain to study production methods at the Royal Ordnance Factory at Leeds and Vickers Armstrong in Newcastle upon Tyne. But the British government was having a bit of a nightmare, with the Ministry of Defence in favour of the deal and the Foreign Office opposed to it for political reasons. The diplomats prevailed, and in December 1969 Britain officially informed Israel that its request to produce the Chieftain tank was refused. In the same month, both Chieftains Mark II were returned to Britain. Nevertheless, the British learned a considerable amount from the Israeli trials and incorporated numerous improvements into production models. However, with stunning duplicity, Britain then offered these Chieftain models to several different Arab powers, including Libya and Iran. Politics. Don't you just love it? The next major variant, the Chieftain Mark III, first rolled off the production line on the 16th of September 1969. It featured an improved life L60 Mark V-A engine of 650 brake horsepower and many other enhancements. Even so, it still remained underpowered for a tank that now weighed 53 tons. And even more worryingly, the L60 engine was increasingly plagued with problems of reliability. Attempts to increase engine output had resulted in even further reduced reliability. And whenever one problem was partially fixed, another component within the powertrain began to suffer repeated breakages. There were four main aspects of engine failure: cracking of the cylinder liners, failure of the cylinder lip seals, piston firing breakages, and cracking of the rear gear cases. All of these problems were eventually fixed, but not before the Chieftain's reputation had been completely flushed down the toilet. The first engine modification program was known as Totem Pole, and was combined with other improvements to upgrade all previous marks of Chieftain to the same standard as the final production vehicle for the British Army, the Mark V. This version incorporated the L60 Mark 8A engine of 750 brake horsepower at 2,250 revs per minute, given a top speed of 30 miles per hour with a road range of 310 miles. The Mark V was the definitive Chieftain tank. It weighed 54.8 tons, which was almost 10 tons greater than the original General Staff requirement, an increase of almost 25%. The problems of engine reliability became so bad that an investigation was undertaken by the British House of Commons, and their findings were published in 1978. The conclusions were not pretty. The report read: "The performance of the Chieftain's gun and range-finding equipment is first class. It is therefore all the more unsatisfactory that the tank should have been let down by its engine in the past. It's difficult to feel confident about the future performance of the engine in the light of the subsequently unfulfilled assurances given by the Ministry of Defence. We wish to assure the House that the present programme of engine modifications, as it has been explained and demonstrated to us, appears to be meeting with success so far. Nevertheless, despite these welcome improvements, we cannot avoid observing in conclusion that the saga of the Chieftain tank is not one which reflects well on the Ministry of Defence, even allowing for an element of sheer bad luck in the problems which have dogged the engine. It is only right to point out that assuming the present programme of modifications represents the final instalment, it will be well over halfway through the Chieftain's active life before it has an engine to match its other undoubted assets." Despite the terrible engine, and let's make no mistake, it was a terrible engine. At one point the British Army of the Rhine estimated that the availability rate of its Chieftain Main Battle Tanks was running at an average of 35%. But despite this, it did have the best main battle tank gun in the world, and it did have the best armour in the world, so, well, 2 out of 3 isn't bad. It's also a deeply sexy looking tank, and that counts for a lot in my book. Well, I say it had the best armour in the world, but I say that with some reservations. At the time of its introduction, it definitely was the most heavily armoured main battle tank in the world, as well as the most heavily armed, at least until the introduction of the Leopard 2. But the armour was not composite. Nobody was building tanks out of composite armour at the time. It was welded and cast steel, and so while the lower glacis would definitely have been vulnerable to shape-charge high explosive anti-tank ammunition, the upper glacis was all but impenetrable, thanks not just to the thickness of the armour, but also the excessive sloping. The turret front was also very, very strong, at least it was when the Chieftain was first introduced into service, but time waits for no man. A T-72 captured from the Iraqis during the Iran-Iraq War one day found itself on a firing range in southern England, where it was invited to put a few shots with its APFS ammunition through the turret front of the Chieftain. It penetrated with relative ease. This led to the introduction of the Stillbrew armour package. Stillbrew armour consists of plates of steel titanium alloy mounted over the cast turret of the tank with a thick layer of a special type of rubber in between as a sandwich. In effect, it was an early type of composite armour. It was manufactured in England and used for the first time in the 1980s to upgrade the Chieftains as part of a crew protection package. The turret front of the Chieftain didn't actually have a gun mantlet. This was in order to take advantage of parking the tank on the reverse slope of a hill and using that 10 degrees of gun depression to not only further increase the effective thickness of the heavily sloped upper glacis, which was only 120mm thick, but sloped back at such an angle that from the front it had an effective thickness of almost 400mm. Sitting the tank in a hold down position on a reverse slope would have increased this even further, and the 10 degrees of gun depression would have allowed the tank to be able to cover up that somewhat vulnerable, especially to shaped charge ammunition, lower glacis. And this kind of role the Chieftain would likely have performed exceptionally well in Western Europe, sitting on the reverse slope of a hill, hull down, practically impenetrable to Soviet 125mm tank gun return fire, and just carving up waves and waves of Soviet tanks with that 120mm gun. Equally importantly, as I believe I may have already mentioned, it's a deeply sexy looking tank. Here in Armoured Warfare, the Chieftain is available in its definitive Mark V version as a Tier 5 main battle tank. Let's take a look at the upgrades that are available for this machine. I do recommend that you first research the Stillbrew armour package. The Chieftain is a well-armoured tank for its tier. With the addition of the Stillbrew package, it becomes a very, very well-armoured tank for its tier. It's not as well-armoured for its tier as the Challenger. Hell, even the Yamato isn't as well-armoured for its tier as the Challenger, but it does the job. The 120mm L11A5 gun does 339 average damage and has 272mm of penetration. You can unlock the L23 Sabo ammunition, which boosts the damage to 388 and gives it 300mm of penetration. You probably want to unlock the engines last because they're all equally terrible. The stock engine does 0 to 32 in 10 seconds. The first engine upgrade, and I use the word upgrade in the loosest possible sense of the word, does 0 to 32 in a, frankly, pretty miserable 9.75 seconds. And once you've saved up all your reputation and credits, you can unlock the top Leyland L60 engine, which only does 0 to 32 in a frankly disastrous 9 seconds. Yep, they're all pretty bad, but hey, unlike the real ones, at least they work all the time. Just in case all that armour wasn't enough, there's also the option to mount a single discharge smoke grenade, as well as options to improve your accuracy, your aiming time, and improve your spotting through concealment like foliage and bushes. As well as the universal retrofit slot, which you get for free, you can also unlock one firepower retrofit slot and 2 armour retrofit slots to further enhance the punching power and the protection of the machine. Unsurprisingly, given the terrible engine, there is no option for a mobility retrofit slot, and I highly recommend that you put a mobility retrofit into the universal slot to increase the hull traverse of this tank, because it kind of sucks, and getting shot in the flanks is never fun. And that is the Chieftain tank in Armoured Warfare, except it sort of isn't, because beginning today, Obsidian Entertainment are introducing the Chieftain Mark VI as a premium Tier 5 main battle tank, and as I mentioned at the start of the video, just in case you've forgotten, I've got 50 codes to give away to some of you lucky people if you haven't already entered the giveaway in the video description. In real life, there were very, very minor differences between a Mark V and a Mark VI Chieftain. In fact, the only real difference was that the Mark VI had a Klansman radio. Here in Armoured Warfare, however, there are some significant differences between the two. The Mark V that you can research in the tech tree is a 1980s version of the Mark V Chieftain with the Stillbrew armour package. The premium Mark VI does not have this, and so the biggest difference between the two tanks is a lack of turret armour protection on the premium Mark VI. What you basically have with a premium Mark VI Chieftain is a completely stock Mark V Chieftain, except it has the addition of the intermediate upgraded Leyland L60 engine, doing 0 to 32 in 9.75 seconds instead of the completely disastrous 10. And of course, let's not forget, it's a premium Tier 5 main battle tank, and that means it earns a bonus reputation and credits, and 50 of you lucky people are going to get one for free. If you're lucky enough to win the giveaway, all you have to do to redeem your code is go along to the Armoured Warfare website, click on your profile, and enter the code in the redeem box as seen here. If you're already in the game, make sure you log out, log back in again, and you'll have a Chieftain Mark 6 sitting waiting in your garage. That's it for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope 50 of you are going to be very pleased with your very sexy looking, I may have mentioned this once or twice, brand new premium Tier 5 main battle tank. As always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.